Welcome to the Ultimate Sports Blog Podcast. Today is Thursday, January 3rd, 2018. Today I want to go over college basketball, NBA, and NHL from last night, go over tonight's slate in each of those three sports, NBA power rankings for the week, do some college hoops resumes, go over a college football coaching move that I briefly discussed on yesterday's podcast, but now it's official. But I would like to start with something I totally forgot to do yesterday. Tyler Trent, 20-year-old former Purdue student who was a super fan of the Boilermakers, unfortunately lost his battle to cancer and passed away on Tuesday night. Such a sad story. He was obviously on Scott Van Pelt's Sports Center a couple of months ago, and they made a bet, and Trent ends up beating Van Pelt in the bet because it had to do with Purdue and Van Pelt's alma mater, Maryland, and Purdue beat Maryland in football, and then Scott Van Pelt had to put the P logo on his head for Tyler, and that was pretty cool, and Van Pelt obviously honored Trent on the show on Tuesday night, and this is just a sad story, and I feel sorry for Trent's family and the University of Purdue. He was such a great kid. Just from seeing the feature on him on game day, he had a lot of positivity to him, and thoughts and prayers go out to his family and the Purdue Boilermakers family. All right, college basketball. Interesting results from yesterday. Prairie View defeats Husk Hill 81-65. Prairie View goes to 2-11. Presbyterian defeats South Carolina State 72-70. Presbyterian improves 8-7. South Carolina State 2-14. Maryland defeats number 24 Nebraska 74-72. Nebraska drops to 11-3. That's okay. Maryland needed this game more. They're now 11-3. Seton Hall defeats Xavier 80-70. Good win for Seton Hall. They're 2-0 in the Big East, 11-3 on the year. Xavier's 9-6. Cincinnati defeats Tulane 93-61. Cincinnati 12-2. Tulane 4-9. Wake Forest defeats Cornell 83-61. Wake 7-5. Cornell 6-8. Number 15 North Carolina defeats Harvard 77-57. Carolina 10-3. Harvard 6-6. Georgetown upsets Butler 84-76. Georgetown 11-3. Butler 9-5. Texas Tech defeats West Virginia 62-59. The 11th ranked team in the country goes to 12-1. West Virginia is 8-5. UCF defeats Temple 78-73. UCF 11-2. Temple 10-3. Columbia defeats Binghamton 65-63. Columbia 4-9. Binghamton 4-11. Brown defeats Maine 75-67. Brown 10-4. Maine 2-13. North Florida defeats Florida National 104-76. North Florida is now 6-9. Vermont defeats Dartmouth 73-59. Vermont 10-4. Dartmouth 9-7. American defeats Boston University 86-74. American 7-5. BU 7-7. Bucknell defeats Army 64-63. Bucknell 7-6. Army 5-9. Campbell defeats Allen 95-48. Campbell's now 7-7. High Point defeats Washington College 101-60. High Point 7-7. Yale defeats Kennesaw State 92-65. Yale 8-3. Kennesaw State 3-12. Lehigh defeats Lafayette 86-83. Lehigh 8-4. Lafayette 3-9. Evansville defeats Drake 82-77. In double overtime, Evansville 7-7. Drake drops to 11-3. Georgia Tech defeats South Carolina Upstate 79-63. Georgia Tech 8-5. South Carolina Upstate 5-10. Stephen F. Austin defeats Southeast Louisiana 65-60. Stephen F. Austin 8-5. Southeast Louisiana 4-10. Nichols defeats Northwestern State 78-72. Nichols 8-6. Northwestern State 5-9. Number 19 Houston defeats Tulsa 74-56. Houston 14-0. Tulsa 10-4. SMU defeats East Carolina 82-54. SMU 10-4. East Carolina 7-6. Omaha defeats North Dakota State 90-77. Omaha 8-8. North Dakota State 6-10. A&M Corpus Christi defeats Central Arkansas 87-75. A&M Corpus Christi 6-8. Central Arkansas 5-9. Northern Iowa upsets Bradley 65-47. Northern Iowa 6-8, Bradley 8-6. Southern Illinois defeats Missouri State 75-70. Southern Illinois 8-6, Missouri State 6-8. Valparaiso defeats Illinois State 58-56. Valparaiso 8-6, Illinois State 7-7. Abilene Christian defeats New Orleans 68-58. Abilene Christian 12-2, New Orleans 5-7. McNeese defeats Incarnate Word 88-77. McNeese 5-9. Incarnate Word 5-9. Lamar drops to Houston Baptist 88-82 in overtime. Houston Baptist 5-7. Lamar 7-7. Number 8 Michigan State defeats Northwestern Big 81-55. Impressive win for Tom Izzo's team. They're 12-2. Northwestern is 9-5. Villanova defeats DePaul 73-68. Villanova 10-4. DePaul 8-5. South Florida upsets UConn 76-68. South Florida 11-2. UConn 9-5. Iowa State defeats Oklahoma State 69-63. Iowa State 11-2. Oklahoma State 6-7. Texas defeats Kansas State 67-47. Texas 9-4. Kansas State 10-3. Number 5 Kansas defeats number 23 Oklahoma 70-63. Kansas 12-0. Oklahoma 11-2. South Dakota defeats Denver 71-70. South Dakota 7-8. Denver 5-12. Loyola Chicago defeats Indiana State 79-44. Loyola Chicago 8-6. Indiana State 8-5. New Mexico defeats Air Force 65-58. New Mexico 7-6. Air Force 5-8. Boise State defeats Wyoming 69-55. Boise 6-8. Wyoming 4-10. UC Santa Barbara defeats Bethesda 109-47. Santa Barbara 11-3. Fresno State defeats San Jose State 73-53. Fresno 10-3. San Jose State 3-10. UNLV defeats Colorado State 78-76. UNLV 7-6. Colorado State 5-9. And last but not least, number 6 Nevada defeats Utah State 72-49. Nevada 14-0. Utah State 10-4. Tonight's slate's pretty big too. I'm going to pick important conference games. 3 o'clock, Lincoln, Pennsylvania at Morgan State. 4 o'clock, Siena at St. Peter's. Southern Miss at Rice. 6 o'clock, LIU, Brooklyn at Sacred Heart. 7 o'clock, Fox Sports 1. Illinois at number 21, Indiana. I think Indiana wins this game comfortably. Illinois is the worst team in the Big Ten, other than Rutgers. Also, at 7 o'clock, but on the Big Ten Network, you have number 25, Iowa at Purdue. Purdue is favored by 10 points. I think that is too high. I think Iowa covers, but Purdue, led by Carson Edwards, gets the win. 7 o'clock, ESPN, Penn State at number 2, Michigan. Michigan's going to destroy Penn State, as the Nittany Lions are a team that is not anywhere close to an NCAA tournament team. Yeah, they have the upset win over Virginia Tech, but that was just the trap game for the Hokies, as Penn State took advantage of it. Pat Chambers is a coach on the hot seat. I think Michigan destroys him. 7 o'clock on ESPNU, you have number 18 NC State at Miami. Important game for Miami. This reminds me a little bit of West Virginia from last night. A team that's under some pressure that needs a win, but I don't think they're going to get the win. I really like Kevin Keats' team a lot. They are indeed, I think, an NCAA tournament team. This team is exceeding my expectations. Meanwhile, Jim Laranaga's team has not. So give me NC State to get the road victory and cover the 1.5 point spread. Charleston and Towson, William and Mary, Delaware, Alon Drexel, Wilmington and James Madison, Quinnipiac and Manhattan, Canisius and Marist, Monmouth and Iona, Ryder and Fairfield, Edward Waters and Stetson, Wagner, Central Connecticut State, Fairleigh Dickinson, Robert Morris, St. Francis, Brooklyn, Bryant. Marshall, Old Dominion's interesting. Marshall has underwhelmed a little bit this year. Old Dominion has overachieved. I think Old Dominion gets the win, but Marshall covers the 7. Colgate, Navy, Wright State, Detroit, Mercy, Chattanooga, Western Carolina, Stanford, and East Tennessee State. The Citadel, Wofford, Mercer, Furman, Holy Cross, Loyola, Maryland, Mount St. Mary, St. Francis, Pennsylvania, Northern Kentucky, and Oakland, Coastal Carolina, Troy. 7:30, CBS Sports Network, George Mason at St. Joe's. I think St. Joe's takes that one. 7:30, another underachieving team from Conference USA, Western Kentucky. They're at Charlotte. I think Western Kentucky wins the game, but Charlotte covers the 8. FIU in Middle Tennessee. Middle Tennessee's been underwhelming in Conference USA. FIU is overachieved. I think FIU gets that win. South Dakota State and Purdue Fort Wayne. Utah Valley Grand Canyon at 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock, Pac-12 Network, Utah and Arizona State. I think Bobby Hurley's team gets this game. My big fear of Bobby Hurley's team long-term is that Bobby Hurley's linked to the UCLA job. Maybe that could distract that team a little bit, but I think Bobby Hurley's one of those coaches that avoids distraction and gets his team ready for games. FAU and UAB, Little Rock and UL Monroe. Georgia Southern at Texas State. Texas State's overachieved so far. They're 11-2. Georgia State and Texas Arlington. Appalachian State and South Alabama. Arkansas State, Louisiana. 2 overachievers in Conference USA, Louisiana Tech and North Texas. I think people thought North Texas and Louisiana Tech were going to be solid, but not this good. I think North Texas gets the win on their home floor. Cleveland State and Milwaukee, North Dakota, Oral Roberts, Youngstown State and Green Bay, Morehead State and Murray State, UTEP and UTSA, Tennessee Martin and Eastern Illinois, Southeast Missouri and SIU Edwardsville. That's 8:30, as well as Tennessee Tech and Tennessee State. 9 o'clock Big Ten Network, Minnesota at number 22, Wisconsin. Wisconsin's a big favorite for good reason, and I think they win and cover this game led by Ethan Happ. Interesting game in the West Coast Conference. St. Mary's at San Francisco on ESPN2. San Francisco, I think, is the second best team in the WCC, and I think they pick off St. Mary's, who's been underwhelming this year. Portland State and Montana State, Northern Arizona and Weber State, 9 o'clock Fox Sports 1, Colorado and Arizona. I think Sean Miller's team is the better team, and I think they get the win. Eastern Kentucky and Austin Peay, Jackson State and Jacksonville State. Southern Utah and Idaho State, Sacramento State and Montana. 9:30 CBS Sports Network, 2, I would say, underachieving American Athletic Conference teams, Wichita State and Memphis. I think Memphis wins, but Wichita State covers the 6.5. 10 o'clock, Loyola Marymount and Pepperdine. Is this a trap game for Marymount, who's overachieved this year so far in the West Coast Conference? I'd say it is, and I think Pepperdine pulls off the outright upset. San Diego at Santa Clara is another interesting trap spot for San Diego, but I think they get the win, but Santa Clara covers. Rio Grande against UC Irvine. I think UC Irvine gets that one. New Mexico State at Cal Baptist. I think New Mexico State holds serve there. Seattle at Cal State Bakersfield. Seattle has been a surprise this year, too. I think they get the win there. Cal at USC, 10 o'clock on the Pac-12 Network. I think USC gets a much-needed home win there. Eastern Washington and Idaho at 10:30. 11 o'clock ESPNU, BYU and Pacific. Is this a trap game for BYU? I'd say it is. Pacific has been pretty good this year, and I think they get the outright upset at home. And last but not least, 11 o'clock on ESPN, Stanford at UCLA. I'm sure this is the Dave Pasch, Bill Walton special. UCLA badly needs this game. This is their first game of Pac-12 play, and I think they get the job done at home against a Stanford team that I don't think is very good. NBA from last night. The Mavericks destroy the Hornets 122-84, an impressive win for the Dallas Mavericks as they go to 18-19. Charlotte drops to 18-19. Luka Doncic continues to be amazing. 18 points and 10 boards. Harrison Barnes had 17. Dennis Smith Jr. had 18 with 7 assists. Wesley Matthews had 11. Dwight Powell had 15 off the bench. Marvin Williams had 10. Kemba Walker had 11. Devontae Graham had 10. Off the bench, Bismack Biyombo had 10. And that was just a terrible performance by James Borregos' team. The Heat defeat the Cavaliers 117-92. The Miami Heat are starting to play better. They're 18-18. Cleveland is 8-30. James Johnson had 11. Justice Winslow and Ronnie McGruder each had 10. Josh Richardson had 24. Kelly Olynyk had 10 off the bench. Daniel Jones Jr. had 13. Tyler Johnson had 16 off the bench. Meanwhile, for Cleveland, Tristan Thompson had 14. Colin Sexton had 12. Rodney Hood had 13. Off the bench, Jordan Clarkson had 11. The Wizards defeat the Hawks 114-98. Washington is 15-23. Atlanta's 11-26. Bradley Beal had 24 points. Tyler Stanorodski had 14. Thomas Bryant had 16. Trevor Ariza had 12. Jeff Green had 22. Their bench didn't do anything. Atlanta, John Collins had 21. Kevin Huerter had 12. Alex Len off the bench had 24 with 11 boards. And DeAndre Bembry off the bench had 11. The Nets defeat the Pelicans 126-121. Brooklyn is 18-21. New Orleans is 17-22. D'Angelo Russell's playing very well for Brooklyn. He had 22 points and 13 assists. Jared Allen and Rodions Carusis each had 10. Joe Harris had 21. Off the bench, Damari Carroll had 19. Shabazz Napier had 12. And Spencer Dinwiddie had 18. Anthony Davis, 34 points and 26 boards. Julius Randle had 21. Alfred Payton had 25 in his first game back with 7 assists. Drew Holiday had 20. Etuan Moore had 16. Their bench didn't do anything. The Celtics defeat the Timberwolves 115-102. Boy, I was wrong on this game. I thought Minnesota was going to pull off a home upset. I was wrong. Boston improves to 22-15, and Minnesota drops to 17-21. Gordon Hayward is the big reason why the Celtics won this game. He came off the bench and provided good minutes for them. 35 points and 4 3-pointers. He looked like the Gordon Hayward from Utah. Also off the bench, Jaylen Brown had 10. The starters, Marcus Morris had 12. Al Horford had 15. Terry Rozier had 16. Andrew Wiggins had 31 points in this game. Karl Anthony Towns had 28 with 12 boards. Tyus Jones had 14. And the Minnesota bench didn't do anything. The Magic defeat the Bulls 112-84. Orlando 17-20. Chicago's 10-28. Nikola Vucevic, 22 points and 12 boards. Aaron Gordon at 18 with 9 assists and 7 boards, so a career game for him. DJ Augustine had 10. Evan Fournier had 13. Off the bench, Mo Bamba had 10. Terrence Ross had 15. Meanwhile, for Chicago, Zach LaVine had 16. Lauri Markkanen and Chris Dunn each had 14. And off the bench, Alec Belankly and Shaquille Harrison each had 11. The Pistons defeat the Grizzlies 101-94, an impressive win for Detroit to go to 17-19. Memphis drops to 18-19. Blake Griffin had 26 points, 7 assists, and 8 boards. Andre Drummond had 11 points and 10 boards. Reggie Jackson had 16 with 7 boards and 5 assists. Reggie Bullock had 13. Off the bench, Langston Galloway had 11, and Luke Kennard had 13. Meanwhile, from Memphis, Jaren Jackson Jr., 26 points and 10 boards. Kyle Anderson had 15. Marcus Gasol had 11. And Dylan Brooks had 14. There's an altercation in the locker room after this game, which I'll get to once I do my power rankings and I discuss the Grizzlies. The 76ers defeat the Suns 132-127. They barely avoid the trap as Philly gets the win. They're 25-14. Phoenix is 9-30. Joel Embiid, 42 points and 18 boards. Ben Simmons had 29 points and 6 assists. JJ Redick had 27. Furkan Korkmaz had 10. Jimmy Butler did not play, and their bench didn't do anything. And Wilson Chandler had an upper respiratory infection. Devin Booker had 37 points and 8 assists. D'Anthony Mellon had 10. DeAndre Ayton had 18 with 11 boards. Off the bench, Josh Jackson had 16. Rashawn Holmes had 13. The Thunder defeat the Lakers 107-100. Paul George heavily booed in this game because Laker fans expected George to be wearing purple and gold, but no, he decided to remain in Oklahoma City as the Thunder go to 24-13. Lakers drop to 21-17. Paul George had 37 points. Russell Westbrook and Steven Adams each had 14. Russell Westbrook obviously had a triple-double, had 16 boards and 10 assists to go with his 14. Steven Adams had 15 boards to go with his 14. Jeremy Grant had 13 with 7 boards. Dennis Schroeder and Abdel Nader had 10 each off the bench. LeBron James not back yet. Brandon Ingram had 17 with 11 boards. JaVale McGee had 15. Josh Hart had 13. Contavious Caldwell-Pope, 25 points with 5 3-pointers off the bench. Only 3 games tonight on the slate on TNT. At 8 o'clock, you have the Raptors at the Spurs. Kawhi Leonard returned to San Antonio. I think the Raptors are going to win. San Antonio is actually a 1.5 favorite. Maybe Kyle Lowry isn't playing that I don't know about, but Kawhi Leonard's going to be heavily booed by the Spurs fans. He wanted out of there, so they're going to boo him. He's going to be motivated. He's going to put up a phenomenal game, and I think he's going to lead the Raptors to a win. So give me the Raptors, and I think they'll win this game by double digits. You have the Nuggets and the Kings at 10 o'clock, and at 10:30 on TNT, you have the Rockets at the Warriors. This is a big game for both these teams. Western Conference Finals rematch. The Warriors are back and healthy. Rockets don't have Chris Paul, so it feels like the conference finals all over again. So give me the Warriors to get the home win, but I think Houston covers the 8. NHL, only a few games on the slate last night. The Penguins absolutely destroyed the Rangers 7-2 at Madison Square Garden. Pittsburgh goes to 22-12-6. New York drops to 17-15-7. Number 1 star of the game with a goal and assist, Crystal Tank. Number 2 star of the game with a goal and assist, Evgeny Malkin. Number 3 star of the game with 28 saves on 30 shots, Matt Murray. The Canucks defeat the Senators 4-3 in overtime. Good win for Vancouver, much needed win. 2019 Forum of the Year. Ottawa's 15-21-5. Number 1 star of the game with a hat trick, Elias Pettersson. Number 2 star of the game with 3 assists, Alex Edler. And the number 3 star of the game with 41 saves on 45 shots, Marcus Högberg. The Flames defeat the Red Wings 5-3. Good come-from-behind win for Calgary. As Calgary goes to 25-12-4, Detroit drops to 15-20-7. Number 1 star of the game with the goal and 3 assists, Johnny Gaudreau. Number 2 star of the game with the goal and 2 assists, Elias Lindholm. And the number 3 star of the game with the goal and an assist, Andreas Athanasiou. The Stars defeat the Devils 5-4 as the Devils came back, but Dallas pulled it out of their butts. As the Stars go to 21-16-4, New Jersey drops to 15-17-7. Number 1 star of the game with 2 goals, Miro Heiskanen. Number 2 star of the game with 2 goals, Tyler Seguin. Number 3 star of the game with 3 assists, Alexander Radulov. The Sharks defeat the Avalanche 5-4. Good win for San Jose, 22-13-7 on the year. Colorado drops to 19-14-8. Number 1 star of the game with a goal and 3 assists, Brett Burns. Number 2 star of the game with 2 goals, Tyson Yost. And the number 3 star of the game with a goal and 3 assists, Joe Pavelski. The Oilers defeat the Coyotes 3-1. Edmonton 19-18-3 on the year. Arizona 17-21-2. Number 1 star of the game with 2 goals and an assist, Connor McDavid. Number 2 star of the game with a goal and assist, Leon Draisaitl. And the number 3 star of the game with a goal, Brad Richardson. Tonight's slate is sizable. We have a 2 o'clock game. It's the Wild and the Maple Leafs. So, rare matinee game on a weekday that's not a holiday. 7 o'clock, Flames, Bruins, Panthers, Sabres, Hurricanes, Flyers, NBCSN. You have the Blackhawks at the Islanders from Nassau Coliseum. I really think the Islanders are going to win this game because they're going to be in their real home arena, the place where they should be playing, and I think they'll get the win over a struggling Blackhawks team. Canucks, Canadiens, 8 o'clock, Capitals, Blues, 10:30, Lightning, Kings. The NBA Power Rankings are coming up next. I'm going to go from 30 to 1 as I do each and every time. Number 30 is the Cleveland Cavaliers. They're arguably the worst team in the league. The other arguments are number 29, the New York Knicks, 28, the Phoenix Suns, and number 27, the Chicago Bulls. All 4 of these teams are clearly tanking. And Zion Williamson is going to be on one of those 4 teams, barring an unexpected bad run from another NBA team, or if the lottery breaks to a not so terrible team getting the number 1 pick, which we've seen several times. Number 26 is the Atlanta Hawks. They're another bad team. 25 is the Washington Wizards. They're an interesting team to watch as the trade deadline approaches. John Wall's out for the year. They got the win last night, but that was against the Hawks at home. Bradley Beal's going to be an interesting game on the trade market. I think that the Lakers are going to be linked to him. Maybe the Celtics if they are willing to give up on Jaylen Brown. And he and Kyrie would be an interesting backcourt. Number 24 is the Orlando Magic. They're reverting into what we think they are, although they did get the win last night, but they won at Chicago. 23 is the Minnesota Timberwolves. I thought they were going to win last night because Kyrie Irving didn't play for Boston, and Boston's been so inconsistent, especially on their home court. But I'll give Boston credit once I get to them in the power rankings. Minnesota is going to be a seller. I think that Robert Covington and Dario Saric are going to be traded again, perhaps, to contenders that could use either a 3-and-D guy or an extra big that can score. Number 22 is the Detroit Pistons. They got a good win last night. They're still hanging around the Eastern Conference playoff race. Number 21 is the Charlotte Hornets. That was just a disaster of a loss last night. I did think the Mavericks would win that game, but I didn't think they would win in that convincing of fashion. If they fall out of the playoff race, maybe Kemba Walker becomes available via trade. Number 20 is the New Orleans Pelicans. The most intriguing storyline in the NBA is what New Orleans is going to do with Anthony Davis. They're rapidly falling out of the Western Conference playoff picture, and they lost to Brooklyn last night. Certainly did not help them in any way, shape, or form. Everybody's linking Davis to Boston or Los Angeles, and this is going to keep going until he's actually traded. I do think he'll eventually be traded, but I don't know if it's going to be in February or in July. And I think it's either going to be Boston or Los Angeles. I almost said Philadelphia. I had Philadelphia in my head because somebody threw that idea at me. And I was listening to Bill Simmons and Kevin O'Connor on The Ringer talking about an Anthony Davis fit in Philadelphia, as the trade would be Davis to Philadelphia and Ben Simmons plus picks back to New Orleans. Number 19, speaking of the Brooklyn Nets, they're number 19. They're out of the bottom 10. They're playing good basketball right now, especially in their home building. 18 is the Utah Jazz. Who's been more disappointing this year than the Utah Jazz? Number 17 is the Memphis Grizzlies. They had an altercation after the game. Omar Caspi got into an altercation in the locker room. There's some punches thrown, apparently, with Garrett Temple. And Shams Charania reported it last night, and I'm interested to see the fallout from this. Number 16 is the Sacramento Kings. I think the biggest surprise in the NBA right now. They're not going to make the playoffs in the loaded West, but I could totally see them making a dumb trade to mortgage their future, to think themselves as a contender. And the same with number 15 on this list, but I think they have a better reason to do it, and that's the Dallas Mavericks. And the reason for them to do it is because of Luka Doncic and the fact that they don't have their first-round pick this year, so why tank? I think it's a big win for the Atlanta Hawks if the Mavs pick ends up a lottery pick. But Luka Doncic is special, and I think that Dallas should make a run for the playoffs. And they're talking about using Wesley Matthews as expiring for something, and they can upgrade the wing position or maybe two guard. Luka Doncic, I know, is a wing/two guard, but he can play a bunch of different positions. He's more of like a point forward kind of a player, like Ben Simmons, like LeBron James. But I'm interested to see what they do. Number 14 is the Miami Heat. They're playing a lot better lately. That's credit to Eric Spoelstra, who does a great job each and every year with that team. Number 13 is the Los Angeles Lakers. I have a feeling LeBron James is going to be back tomorrow night against the Knicks. And I can't fault them for losing those few games without him, because they basically won at Golden State without him, and that kind of makes up for it. And then they won at home against Sacramento. Let's face it, you got to win at home against Sacramento, regardless of Sacramento overachieving or not. But with or without LeBron, you got to win that game at home. They should have beaten Sacramento in Sacramento, but Sacramento got them at the buzzer a few nights ago before the Lakers got their revenge on them at home. And then their other loss without LeBron was against the Clippers at the Staples Center. And it was a Laker home game. And then they lose last night to Paul George and Russell Westbrook. Can't fault them losing the red-hot Oklahoma City, though. Speaking of the Clippers, they're number 12. They're playing good basketball right now. I think that's a team that has a trade to make, too. And they have the assets to do so. Number 11 is the Portland Trailblazers. They've been very inconsistent over the last few weeks, but they're right there in the Western Conference playoff picture. Number 10 is the Boston Celtics. That was a big win last night against a bad Minnesota team. And a great sign for them was the performance by Gordon Hayward last night. Number 9 is the San Antonio Spurs. I think tomorrow, or I should say tonight, is their Super Bowl game. It's the biggest game of their season by far. Kawhi Leonard back in San Antonio. You're favored. Do I think they're going to win? No. Unless if Kawhi doesn't play. If Kawhi plays, they're going to lose, and they're going to lose by double digits. Kawhi's going to be heavily booed. But that said, San Antonio has been playing great basketball lately. So I won't be surprised if they win tonight, even if Kawhi Leonard plays. Number 8 is the Philadelphia 76ers. They're playing good basketball right now. Their bench has been a little better than I expected, although I think they do need to make some moves to upgrade that. Number 7 is the Indiana Pacers. They've been playing great basketball. Miles Turner's reinvented himself as a defensive force again. Number 6 is the Houston Rockets. They've been playing really good basketball. They have a big one tonight at Golden State. Number 5 is the Toronto Raptors. They've been playing decently. They have a big one tonight, obviously, against Kawhi's old team that I've discussed a lot on the podcast already. Number 4 is the Golden State Warriors. People are probably saying, why are the Golden State Warriors at number 4? I'll tell you why the Golden State Warriors are number 4. They just haven't seemed right to me. That loss to the Lakers without LeBron on Christmas was not good. They have let bad teams hang around in some of these games. Even Phoenix hung around with them for a little while, and then they ended up winning by double digits anyway. But tonight's a big one for Golden State. I do think they get the win, but like I said, I think the Rockets cover the point spread. And they almost lost to Luka Doncic and the Mavs a few nights ago as well. Number 3 is the Oklahoma City Thunder. They've been very, 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 very impressive. I don't know if they win that game last night if LeBron plays, but they certainly would have been in that game for sure, even with LeBron. But that was a good win last night, and they've just been sensational lately. Number 2 is the Denver Nuggets. They have the best record in the West. What else could I say? They've been so good. And number 1, the Milwaukee Bucks. Giannis Antetokounmpo is the MVP favorite right now because the Bucks have the best record in the NBA. Will that last is the question. That's remained to be seen, as the Bucks have just, like I said, been playing exceptionally well. Giannis Antetokounmpo, crazy stat that I've come across, is averaging 12 rebounds. That's crazy. And he's certainly capable of putting up Russell Westbrook-esque numbers, and I mean that by triple doubles. And I think that Milwaukee's headed for big things this year. And I'm very interested to see how the Eastern Conference shakes out in terms of the playoff picture. Before we do the college basketball resumes, Dana Holgorsen, I touched on this yesterday, is indeed going to Houston to be their new head coach. This is a great hire for the Cougars and a bad loss for the Mountaineers. I talked about the Houston aspect of it on yesterday's podcast and how I think Holgorsen can do. And today I'm going to discuss who I think is in play to replace Dana Holgorsen as West Virginia's head coach. I think the guys that are in play to replace Dana Holgorsen, Luke Fickell of Cincinnati. That would be kind of funny because Bob Huggins went from Cincinnati to West Virginia too, but in fairness, Huggins' alma mater was West Virginia, so that would make more sense for Huggins to do than Fickell. But Fickell has some ties from the area, and the guy that I think is the best fit for it is Troy's Neil Brown. And Troy really has pulled off some big upsets under Neil Brown. LSU in 2017, Nebraska last year. And I think that this is the best fit for the Mountaineers, although Fick will be good too. Jason Candle of Toledo. Toledo, I thought underwhelmed a little bit this year, but Candle coached under Matt Campbell, who is now Iowa State's head coach, and Campbell's done excellent there, so I could see that being a consideration for the Mountaineers. Mike Norvell of Memphis, he's done a great job there. Seth Littrell at North Texas, that's another fine candidate. He did a nice job. And more, Dan Enos, who is the associate head coach and quarterbacks coach for Nick Saban at Alabama. And there's could be other more possible guys as well. Maybe Josh Heupel of UCF. It could be a dark horse candidate. I saw somebody throw out Rich Rod's name, but I don't see Rich Rod going back to Morgantown, although that would be a pretty fun story. So this should be really, really interesting to watch, and I think Troy Brown is the guy that's going to get this job because I think he is the hot name right now, and the way he's turned that Troy program around, I think he'd be a very fine fit in Morgantown. Now we're going to go to the college hoops resumes. We're just going to do the notable conferences. We're going to start with the American Athletic Conference. Cincinnati is 12-2 on the year, 1-0 in AAC play. They lost to Ohio State on the first night of the season, and their other loss came at Mississippi State, who was 18th at the time. Notable wins are against Xavier, who's underwhelmed this year, UCLA, who's also been very underwhelming, Ole Miss on a neutral, and they have a win against George Mason. They've been underwhelming. UNLV's been underwhelming too. UConn is 9-5 on the year, 0-1 in conference play. They lost last night at South Florida. Their signature win that they're going to be holding on Selection Sunday as they make their case to see how they would do in conference play is against Syracuse, who was ranked 15th at the time at Madison Square Garden. That's their lone signature win. All their other wins are against subpar opponents. They lost against Iowa on a neutral. At home against Arizona. They lost against Florida State, who was 11th at the time. They lost at Villanova. No shame in losing to Villanova, even though Villanova's down. But their worst loss was probably last night against the South Florida team, which may not be very good, but who knows? Maybe I'm wrong about South Florida. I'll get to them in a minute. East Carolina 7-6 on the year, 0-1 in conference play. Their best win is probably against Appalachian State, which was only by 2 points. Losses, James Madison at Georgia Tech. And Georgia Tech's been underwhelming in the ACC. High Point at UNC Wilmington. Wilmington has underachieved this year in the CAA. At Charlotte and at SMU. And SMU is a team that's playing a lot better lately, and that was obviously last night. Houston is 14-0 and 1-0 in conference play. They won last night convincingly against Tulsa. Other notable wins, St. Louis, Utah State, at Oklahoma State, at BYU, at home against then number 18 Oregon. Memphis is 8-5 on the year. They have not played a conference game yet. I'm interested to see how their season shakes out. They actually played tonight against Wichita State at 9:30 on CBS Sports Network. That's going to be interesting. Their best win is at home in double overtime against Yale. They beat South Dakota State, which is a pretty solid team from the Summit League. Their losses at LSU, who is number 22 at the time. Against Oklahoma State on a neutral. Against Charleston on a neutral. Against Texas Tech on a neutral. No shame in that. And then they lost by double digits at home against Tennessee, who was number 3 at the time. No shame in that. But their losses are all against decent teams. No bad ones per se in terms of inferior opponents. SMU is 9-4 on the year, 1-0 in conference play. They beat East Carolina last night. Their best non-con win is at Georgetown. They have losses to Southern Miss, Lipscomb. Lipscomb isn't bad, actually. Against Bradley on a neutral, and then against TCU. South Florida, 11-2, 1-0 in conference play. They beat UConn last night. That's their best win right now. They lost against Georgetown by 3 points on a neutral, and they lost to the Citadel. They beat Appalachian State. They won at FIU. They beat Ohio. They beat Austin P. Temple, 10-3 in the year, 0-1 in conference play. Their lone loss in conference play came last night at UCF. The other losses came against VCU on a neutral and at number 21 Villanova, then number 21. Any good wins on here? Yes, they do have some fine wins. At Missouri's a good one. Against Davidson in overtime on a neutral is a nice one. Cal's underwhelming, but you got to give credit to that one. They beat Georgia and Tom Crean. Tulane's the worst team in the AAC. They're 4-9 in the year, 0-1 in conference play. They lost last night at Cincinnati. They don't really have any good wins other than South Dakota State. They lost against then number 17 Florida State. And they lost to a bunch of subpar teams. Louisiana is a team that actually might win the Sun Belt Conference. So that's not a terrible loss per se. Tulsa's 10-4 in the year, and they lost last night to Houston. So they're 0-1 in conference play. They lost against Nevada on the neutral. No shame in that. They lost at Utah. Utah hasn't been that great this year. Their best win is at home against then number 16 Kansas State. They beat Dayton, who's not a bad team, and then they knocked off Oklahoma State. And that's a pretty good win as well. UCF is 11-2 on the year, 1-0 in conference play. They beat, obviously, Temple last night. Their 2 losses came on a buzzer beater against FAU at home and to Missouri in overtime. So their 2 losses come from a combined 3 points. And they have a win against Alabama on their schedule. That's not bad. Illinois State, they knocked off. They knocked off Georgia Southern. They beat St. Joe's on a neutral. Western Kentucky on a neutral. So not a bad resume for UCF. Oh, and they knocked off Rider as well, who came in as the preseason favorite in the MAAC. And last but not least, Wichita State, 7-5 on the year. They begin conference play tonight at Memphis. They've been underwhelming. They have a good win against Providence, and then they beat Baylor, too, which those two wins are pretty good. Appalachian State's not a bad result either. And their losses came against Louisiana Tech, who I've talked about briefly before. They've overachieved this year. Against Davidson on the neutral, not bad. Against Alabama on the neutral, that's an SEC team and a good coach. Against Oklahoma on the neutral, Oklahoma is much better than I anticipated. And at VC was not a bad loss either. So they lost to all, I think, decent teams. And all these teams, I think, other than maybe Alabama, are capable of making the tournament. ACC. Boston College is 9-3 on the year. ACC begins some of its conference play tonight. Only one conference game was played so far now. It's between Notre Dame and Virginia Tech on New Year's Day. Boston College has been a little better than I thought. Their best win looks like right now at DePaul. Only by 3 in DePaul. I think it's overachieved so far this year. Minnesota's actually a decent win too, as well as against Loyola Chicago on a neutral. They lost to Providence at home, and they lost a bye game to Indiana, Purdue, and they lost to Hartford by 1 point at home as well. Clemson's 10-3 on the year. They have some decent wins. They beat Georgia on a neutral, and they knocked off Lipscomb, who might be the favorite in the Atlantic Sun at home. They lost to Creighton on a neutral. They lost to Nebraska at home. Nebraska is one of the better teams in the Big Ten so far, and then they lost at then number 22 Mississippi State. Duke is excellent. They're 11-1. They have a ton of good wins. Their lone loss came against then number 3 Gonzaga on a neutral. They knocked off Kentucky and Chicago on opening night, and that's why they have that reputation of the best team in the country. And if it wasn't for that win, I don't know if they're even number 1. Michigan might be number 1 if not for that. They beat Indiana. That's a good win. They knocked off Auburn on a neutral. San Diego State's underwhelming. They knocked off Yale, who I think is capable of winning the Ivy League. And they also knocked off Texas Tech at MSG, and Texas Tech is a pretty good team in the Big 12. Florida State's 12-1 on the year. They killed Florida on opening night. They have a win on a neutral against Purdue and against LSU. Their lone loss came against Villanova on a neutral. They beat St. Louis on a neutral. They beat UConn on a neutral. Georgia Tech's 8-5, so that's a bit underwhelming. They have a couple bye losses. Obviously, Gardner-Webb. They lost to Georgia at home. They lost at Northwestern. That's not a bad one. At number 5, Tennessee, no shame in losing to them. They lost to St. John's, who only has 1 loss on the year. And they really don't have any good wins, unless if you consider Arkansas a good one. And they beat East Carolina, too, but East Carolina isn't good. Louisville's 9-4. They're good wins, obviously, at home against Michigan State in overtime. That's going to resonate with them on Selection Sunday. They have a win over perhaps the America East favorite in Vermont. They beat Lipscomb. I discussed them a minute ago. The losses came on a neutral against Tennessee. No shame in that. On a neutral against Marquette in overtime. They lost at home to Kentucky, and Kentucky's a team that looks like it's fine. It's stride a little bit. And they lost at Indiana on a buzzer beater. No shame in that. Chris Mack. Miami has a big one tonight against NC State at home as they begin conference play. They have some weird losses against Ivy League schools at Penn and then on a neutral against Yale. They lost to Seton Hall on a neutral. They have a home loss to Rutgers, which is very bad. They have a win against Lehigh at home again, and Lehigh's a team that people think can win the Patriot League. They knocked off an underwhelming LaSalle team. Fresno State's a team in the Mountain West Conference that has been solid so far. They have a win against FAU. Stephen F. Austin might be the Southland winner this year. So they have some okay wins, per se. North Carolina's 10-3. They are an interesting team, obviously. They lost on the neutral at Texas on Thanksgiving. Lost at number 7 Michigan pretty convincingly, and they lost to Kentucky on a neutral recently. So their losses are to big-name schools and big-name coaches in Shaka Smart, John Beilein, and John Calipari. They're good wins, obviously, at home against Gonzaga. That's going to resonate with them if they are to get a high seed line. Stanford's not good. They have a neutral win against UCLA that was ranked at the time, but UCLA is trash right now. They have a win over Davidson at home. Davidson's a team that can win the Atlantic 10. Harvard at home. Harvard's a team that I think can win the Ivy. And then they have the true road wins at Wofford and Adelon. Wofford's a team that I think could make the tournament in their conference. NC State's 12-1. They have a big one tonight at Miami to begin conference play. Their lone loss came at Wisconsin by 4 points, or else they'd be unbeaten. But that's okay. No shame in losing to Wisconsin. They have a great win at home against number 7 Auburn, or then number 7 Auburn. They beat Penn State on a neutral. Penn State's just not good. And they have a win over Vanderbilt, but that's without Garland. So there's nothing really to take account of that, as Vanderbilt was missing their best player. Mercer's a team that can win their conference. I think they're in the SoCon with Wofford. The SoCon's good. They have Mercer, Wofford, and Furman all in that conference, all capable of making the tournament and doing damage as their auto bid. Notre Dame's 10-4, 0-1 in conference play. They lost at Virginia Tech recently. They lost at the buzzer to UCLA. They lost at MSG to Oklahoma by 5, and they lost on a neutral against Radford. I think conference play is going to tell whether this team's good or not. They have a win on a neutral against Purdue. They beat DePaul at home, but I'm not a huge fan of DePaul. Illinois is the worst team in the Big Ten other than Rutgers. Duquesne's a team that has some nice wins, so Notre Dame knocked them off earlier in the year. Pitt's 10-3, that's impressive. They have a win over St. Louis on a neutral, which could resonate with them if they are in play for an at-large. They have a loss at Iowa, who was number 14 at the time, a bye loss to Niagara, which sucks, and they lost at West Virginia. That's not a bad loss. The Mountaineers, although have underachieved this year, losing at West Virginia is not a bad thing. Syracuse is 9-4. I feel like this team's underachieved this year. Their best win is at number 16 Ohio State, or I should say then 16 Ohio State. They have a home win against Georgetown, which is looking better by the day. St. Bonaventure's underwhelming so far, so I can't say that's a good win. Their losses came at MSG against UConn and against then number 13 Oregon. They lost to Old Dominion at home, and Old Dominion's a team that looks like it's better than we anticipated, and they lost at home to then number 14 Buffalo. And Buffalo is a team that's going to be a single-digit seed if they have a good conference slate. Virginia's 12-0. They have some solid wins on their resume, including at then number 24 Maryland and on a neutral against then number 25 Wisconsin. Middle Tennessee's been underwhelming. Dayton has been okay. At South Carolina is a nice win, but not a great win, especially this year. Marshall's been underwhelming. Virginia Tech's 12-1, 1-0 in conference play. Their lone loss came by 1 point at Penn State. They beat Notre Dame. That was a good win. They knocked off Purdue on a neutral. That's a good win. And they were an underdog in that game too. And they won on a neutral against Washington, which is a pretty good win as well. Wake Forest is 7-5 on the year. They have a couple bye losses, including against Gardner-Webb and Houston Baptist. The Houston Baptist game was in overtime, by the way. They lost at Richmond. They lost at Tennessee. No shame in losing at Tennessee. And they lost to St. Joseph's on the neutral. Those were their losses. Their best win was at home against Davidson. They beat Valparaiso on a neutral, but Valparaiso isn't the Valparaiso from the Horizon League, which was pretty good. Atlantic 10. Davidson's 9-4. their best win, to me, was against Wichita State on a neutral. They beat Charlotte, too. UNC Wilmington's underwhelming. Their losses against then number 23 Purdue, against Temple, at Wake Forest, and at number 14 North Carolina. They might be the favorites to win the Atlantic 10 tournament. Dayton's 8-5. They've been a little underwhelming this year with Anthony Grant at the helm. Their losses, not terrible losses, by the way, I should say. They lost to Virginia on a neutral, no shame in that. They lost to Oklahoma on a neutral, no shame in that. Home against number 25 Mississippi State, at number 8 Auburn, and against Tulsa on a neutral. Their worst loss of those is against Tulsa, and Tulsa's 10-4. So I should say that Dayton lost to the best 5 teams it's played. The Canes 9-4. Their best win to me looks like right now a home against Marshall. Losses against NJIT, who's been pretty good in the Atlantic Sun. Home Penn State, at Pitt, and at Notre Dame are their other losses. Fordham's 9-4, but they were better than that at one point, and then they lost a couple bye games to LIU, Brooklyn, and NJIT, and they lost in double overtime at Maine, and they lost at Houston Baptist, too. Their best win was home against Rutgers. And then they've knocked off FIU, too, which isn't a bad team. Columbia they knocked off, but Columbia isn't that good. George Mason's been underwhelming. They're 6-7. They have a lot of bye losses. They lost at home to Penn, at home to American in overtime. They lost at Georgia Southern. Home Cincinnati. Neutral Cincinnati, neutral Baylor. Home Vermont, can't say that's a bad loss because Vermont, I think, is the America East favorite. And then at Kansas State. They really don't have a win that I could say wow about. George Washington's 4-9. That's really bad. They lost to Stony Brook at home in overtime on the first night of the season. They lost at home to Siena, at number 5 Virginia. Or then number 5 Virginia. Then number 18 Michigan on a neutral. South Carolina on a neutral. Vermont, not a bad loss though. At Princeton, Valparaiso, and at Hartford. Breaking baseball news I'm going to get to when I'm done with this basketball thing. LaSalle's 2-10. They've been the most disappointing team, I think, in the Atlantic 10 this year. And they have losses against a bunch of random teams. At Temple, Lafayette, at Florida, Drexel versus Miami, versus Northwestern, versus Grand Canyon. They almost knocked off then number 23 Villanova. They lost to Bucknell, and then they lost to Penn State. And they beat Alabama A&M on a neutral, and then they beat Towson on a neutral too. So not a good beginning for LaSalle. UMass has some interesting results. Their best win was at Providence. And they lost to Harvard, Howard, neutral against Nevada, who was 6 at the time. Holy Cross, at Temple, and at Georgia. Rhode Island 7-5. Their best win was on a neutral against West Virginia. They beat Brown, who has been a surprise in the Ivy League so far. Middle Tennessee has not been the Middle Tennessee that I thought they'd be. They lost to Providence. They lost at Charleston. Lost at home to Stony Brook, who has been pretty good in the America East this year, and then on a neutral to Hawaii and on a neutral to Bucknell. Richmond's been underwhelming. Their best win was at home against Wake Forest. St. Bonaventure's been very underwhelming. They don't really have a good win that I could point my finger at. St. Joe's is 7-5. Their best win looks like home against Old Dominion right now. They beat Wake Forest on a neutral. That's a pretty good win, too. At Princeton isn't bad. Wagner's been pretty good in the NEC. They have losses to UCF and West Virginia on neutrals. They lost to Temple and Villanova. And they lost to William & Mary. St. Louis is 9-4. This was the preseason pick to win the Atlantic 10. They have 2 good wins. Home Butler and at Seton Hall. They beat Oregon State, too. That's not a pretty That's not a bad result to have either. Appalachian State's okay. They lost on a neutral to Penn, on a neutral to Florida State, at Houston, and then at home against Southern Illinois. VCU's 9-4. Their best win is at Texas. They knocked off Wichita State too, which was a pretty good win. They lost to St. John's on a neutral at Old Dominion, at number 4 Virginia. It was 4 at the time, and then at home against Charleston. Before I move on to the Big East, breaking news: David Robertson's going to the Philadelphia Phillies. 2-year deal, $23 million guarantee. That's a big addition for Philadelphia to upgrade their bullpen. Yankees have to pivot, I guess, to Adam Ottavino and Zach Britton. Now let's move on to the Big East. Any other breaking baseball news, I'm more than welcome to break it on the podcast. We're now going to go to the Big East. Seton Hall is 11-3 on the year, 2-0 in conference play. They have a lot of great wins on the year. They knocked off Miami in the Wooden Legacy Championship. They lost at Nebraska, not bad. They lost at home to St. Louis, which might not look great at the end of the year depending on how St. Louis does in conference play. They have their signature win at MSG against number 9 Kentucky, or then number 9 Kentucky. They lost at home to Louisville. They have the buzzer beater win over St. John's. They have the win at Maryland. And they just knocked off Xavier by 10 in conference play. Georgetown's a surprising 11-3 on the year and 1-0 in conference play. They knocked off Butler last night. They have some other decent results. They won at Illinois, but Illinois is not good. The South Florida win is looking better by the day. They barely lost to Syracuse. That's not a terrible loss. And that win's going to resonate for Syracuse. They have a home loss to SMU. SMU's playing a little better. Appalachian State isn't that bad. Villanova's been underwhelming, but they're 1-0 in conference play, 10-4 on the year. They barely knocked off DePaul yesterday. They lost badly at home to Michigan. Lost in overtime to a surprising Furman team. They won the Advocare Invitational with wins over Canisius, Oklahoma State, and then number 14, Florida State. Florida State looks like a good win. Now Florida State's only loss as well. They won at home against Temple. That's going to be a decent win. They lost at Penn. That's a bad one. They lost at then number 1 Kansas, but not a bad loss to lose at Kansas. They knocked off UConn. Creighton is 10-4 in the year, 1-0 in conference play. Creighton, I think, is a team that can make the tournament. They lost at home to Ohio State. They knocked off Clemson in the Cayman Islands Classic. They knocked off Boise State. They lost at home to Gonzaga. No shame in that. Gonzaga was 1 at the time. They lost at number 24 Nebraska. No shame in that. They lost to Oklahoma. No shame in that. They knocked off Providence at the Dunkin' Donuts Center on Monday as they began conference play. Xavier's 9-6 on the year and 1-1 in the Big East. They lost at home to Seton Hall last night, and they opened conference play with the win at DePaul. They lost at home to Wisconsin. They knocked off Evansville, who people thought that was going to be underwhelming this year. They lost in overtime against Auburn in the Maui Invitational. And then they lost to San Diego State in the Maui. They knocked off Illinois, who's been underwhelming. They lost at Cincinnati, and they lost at Missouri. So this isn't Xavier of old, and they've really missed Chris Mack. St. John's is 13-1 the year, 1-1 in conference play. If it wasn't for a bad call, they'd be 14-0. Their good wins are, or I should say notable wins, at Rutgers, neutral against Cal, neutral against VCU, neutral against Georgia Tech. They knocked off Princeton at MSG. They should have beaten Seton Hall, but Seton Hall got them on a buzzer beater courtesy of a bad call. They knocked off Wagner a few weeks ago, and Wagner is one of the usually better teams in the NEC. And then they bounced back in a big way from the blown game against Seton Hall and knock off number 16 Marquette by 20. They have a big one coming up on Saturday at Georgetown, which I will pick on Saturday morning's podcast. Butler's 9-5, 0-1 in conference play. They dropped the game to Georgetown last night at home. Butler's been a little underwhelming. Their notable results: home win over Ole Miss, neutral losses against Dayton. They actually knocked off Florida in the battle for Atlantis, and they knocked off Middle Tennessee, who's been underwhelming. They lost at St. Louis. They lost to number 25 Indiana in the Crossroads Classic. That was actually a buzzer beater. Rob Finizzi. And then they lost badly at Florida, so Florida avenged that loss. Number 16 Marquette is 0-1 in conference play with that ugly loss to St. John's. They're 11-3 on the year, but Marquette, in fairness, wasn't favored in that game. St. John's was, but it's still not a great loss to take if you're Marquette. They lost to Indiana was unranked at the time, and that was at Assembly Hall, so at Indiana's not a bad loss for Marquette. And then they lost against Kansas on a neutral. They beat Louisville on a neutral, so you can make a case that they lost to the best three teams they've played. Their good win, as I see right now, is the Louisville win. Oh, and they knocked off then number 12 Kansas State. That's a good win, too. And then they knocked off then number 12 Wisconsin. So they do have some good wins on their schedule. And then number 14 Buffalo. So Marquette's in better shape than I anticipated. So they can afford that. Providence is 10-4 in the year, 0-1 in conference play. They just dropped that conference game to Creighton on Monday. They have wins over, they have a loss against Wichita State on a neutral. They knocked off South Carolina on a neutral. They lost to then number 18 Michigan on a neutral. December, they beat Rhode Island, underwhelming. They won in overtime at Boston College. That looks like their best win right now. Oh, wait, no, take that back. They won at Texas. That's a good win, too. And they lost at home to UMass. The Pauls 8-5 on the year and 0-2 in conference play. They lost at home against Xavier, and then they lost at Villanova. And they do have some other notable results. They lost at Notre Dame. They knocked off Penn State in overtime, which looks like a okay win, but not a great win. They lost at Northwestern. They lost at home to Boston College. And then they took care of business against weaker opponents in their bye games. I'm going to do the Big Ten next. Michigan State is 12-2 on the year, 3-0 in conference play. They just knocked off Northwestern in a big way. They beat UCLA on a neutral and Texas on a neutral to win the Vegas tournament Thanksgiving weekend. They lost at Louisville and they lost against Kansas on a neutral. They beat Rutgers to begin conference play about a month ago. They have a conference win over then number 18 Iowa at home. They knocked off Florida in Florida, so that's going to be a decent win for them. Michigan is 13-0 on the year and 2-0 in conference play. They are obviously unbeaten. Their best win is obviously at then number 8 Villanova in what was a rematch of the title game. They knocked off Providence on a neutral. They beat then number 11 North Carolina at home on a nationally televised game. They knocked off then number 19 Purdue. They won at Northwestern. They knocked off South Carolina at home. And their next game is tonight at home against Penn State. Ohio State's 12-1 on the year. Their lone loss came at home against Syracuse. They knocked off Cincinnati to begin the year. Other notable games is that they won against Creighton. They won at home against Minnesota, at Illinois in conference play. CBS Sports Classic, they knocked off UCLA. Indiana's 11-2, 2-0 in conference play. They have a win over then number 24 Marquette. They lost at Arkansas by 1 point. They lost badly at then number 3 Duke, but no shame in losing to Duke. They beat Northwestern at home. They won barely at Penn State. They knocked off Louisville at home. They knocked off Butler in the Crossroads Classic on a buzzer beater. And then they host Illinois tonight. Number 22, Wisconsin, 10-3 on the year, 2-0 in conference play. They knocked off Xavier. They have a win over Stanford in the Battle for Atlantis, a win over Oklahoma in the Battle for Atlantis. They lost to Virginia in the Battle for Atlantis. They knocked off NC State, which looks like a great win right now. They knocked off then number 14 Iowa at Iowa. They beat Rutgers. They lost at Marquette in overtime. That's okay. And they lost at Western Kentucky, a team that's underwhelmed this year. And then tonight they play at home against Minnesota. Maryland is 11-3 on the year, 2-1 on the year. They have the loss to Seton Hall. They knocked off Nebraska at home last night. Minnesota's 11-2 on the year, 1-1 in conference play. They have that loss against Boston College, and their other loss came, I believe it was on a neutral to somebody, or could have been at somebody in conference play. Oh, it was at Ohio State. And in the rest of the games, they did pretty well. They knocked off Nebraska, which was one of their 2 conference losses. Purdue is 8-5 on the year, 1-1 in conference play. Very underwhelming for Purdue so far. They lost to Virginia Tech on a neutral. That's okay. They lost to Florida State in the ACC Big Ten Challenge. They lost badly at then number 7 Michigan. They knocked off Maryland at home. Decent win there. They lost to Texas. Lost to Notre Dame in the Crossroads. They have a win over Belmont that can win their league. And they have a big game tonight at home against number 25 Iowa. We talked about Nebraska. They have 3 losses, 1 at Minnesota. They lost last night against Maryland. That's okay. They have some good wins, including one against Seton Hall. They won at Clemson. Their other loss came on a neutral against Texas Tech. Iowa's 11-2 on the year, and their 2 losses were 2 conference games. One at Michigan State, and then the other against Wisconsin at home. And then the rest of their non-con, they took care of business, including 2 wins at MSG, 1 over number 13 Oregon, and 1 over UConn. They knocked off Pitt at home. Rutgers is 7-5 on the year, 0-2 in conference play. They have losses to Wisconsin and Michigan State in conference play. They have a loss to Seton Hall. Their best win is at Miami. And they lost to St. John's on a neutral. Or that might actually have been a home game. Take that back. Penn State's 7-6 on the year, 0-2 in conference play. They have a game tonight at Michigan. They lost to Indiana and Maryland in conference play. Maryland was road, Indiana was home. They have a loss to NC State on a neutral. They lost to Alabama. They have the Virginia Tech win to hang their hat on. That's their only good win right now. That is significant. Illinois is 4-9, 0-2 in conference play. Northwestern is 9-5 in the year, 0-3 in conference play. Illinois literally has no good wins. Northwestern has a couple decent-ish wins. Big 12 real quick. Kansas is 1-0 in conference play with their win over Oklahoma last night. Their lone loss came against Arizona State at Arizona State. Texas Tech 12-1 near their lone loss came at MSG against Duke. They knocked off West Virginia last night. Iowa State's 1-0 in conference play, 11-2 in general. They knocked off Oklahoma State last night. Their two losses came in the Maui against Arizona and against Iowa in the Cy-Hawk. Texas is 9-4 in the year. They got a big win last night at Kansas State to start off conference play. They have a couple bad losses, and they do have that big win over North Carolina, who was 7th at the time. They lost to Michigan State, no shame in that. They have a couple bye losses, too, which isn't great. They lost to VCU. They lost to Providence. Those aren't bye games, though. Those are just not great losses in both home games. And then they beat Purdue, which isn't a bad result at all. TCU's 11-1 on the year. They haven't played a conference game yet. Their lone loss came at home against Lipscomb. And Lipscomb's probably the favorite in the Atlantic Sun this year. Baylor's 8-4. They've lost a couple byes, including to Texas Southern on the first night of the season. They lost against Ole Miss. They lost against Wichita State, and they lost at home against Stephen F. Austin. Oklahoma lost at Kansas last night. They're 11-2 on the year. Their other loss came against Wisconsin in the battle for Atlantis, which isn't bad. They have some good wins, including over Wofford, who I think could sneak in the tournament as an auto bid winner. They win over Florida. They will win over a pretty good North Texas team. They have a win over Dayton. They have the win over USC. They have a win over Creighton. They have a win over Northwestern, which came in overtime. They have a win over Wichita State, and then they won at MSG against Notre Dame. Kansas State is 10-3. They lost badly last night to Texas. They have a loss at Marquette, and then they lost to Tulsa. And in terms of good wins, Vanderbilt, but they're missing their point guard. Penn's okay. Missouri, I guess, but nothing wow. West Virginia is an underwhelming 8-5. They lost last night to Texas Tech at home in a close game. And they lost at home to Buffalo. They have a bad loss against Western Kentucky on a neutral, against Rhode Island on a neutral. But I'm interested to see if the committee takes in account that a lot of their losses came without Sagaba Konate, who's their starting center. Awesome shot block guy. And West Virginia's best win right now is at home against Pitt. Oklahoma State 6-7 on the year. They just lost to Baylor. They lost to Iowa State. That's my bad. And Oklahoma State isn't a terrible team, per se, but they're probably just the worst team in the Big 12. They lost at Tulsa. They lost to Houston. They lost to Nebraska. They beat Charleston, which is a decent win. They have won over Memphis, which is okay. They lost to Villanova. They lost to LSU. They lost to Minnesota. Now we're going to go to the Mountain West real quick and go over some of these teams' resumes. Nevada, 14-0. This is just amazing. They knocked off Utah State last night. Other good wins include over BYU on the first night of the year, Tulsa, neutral, Loyola Chicago, at Loyola Chicago, I should say, neutral against Arizona State, at USC, home South Dakota State, and at Utah. Fresno State's a surprising 10-3 on the year. They opened conference play with the win over underwhelming San Jose State. Their losses came at TCU. They knocked off Northwestern. That's a good win. They lost to Miami, and their other loss came against Utah Valley at home, which is not a good loss. Utah State's the other team I want to go over real quick. They're 10-4, even though they just lost to Nevada. But they had 3 losses out of the conference, which came against Arizona State. Not bad. They also lost to BYU on the road. That's okay. And then they lost at number 21 Houston. So that's not a bad team in the Mountain West. And then San Diego State's been underwhelming. Pac-12 really quick. Arizona State is 9-3. They have that great Kansas win. They have that terrible loss to Princeton. They lost to Vanderbilt. And then they also have a loss to Nevada, which is not a bad loss. Colorado is a surprising 9-3. They really don't have what I would say a signature win, but they did lose to both Indiana State and Hawaii in the Diamond Head Classic, which resulted them finishing in 5th place in that, and then they lost at San Diego, and San Diego is one of the better teams in the West Coast Conference this year. Arizona's 9-4. They host Colorado tonight, actually. They have 4 losses on the year. They have some good wins, too, including against Iowa State and Maui. 2 of their losses came in Maui, one against then number 3 Gonzaga and the other against then number 8 Auburn. Those are not bad losses. They won at UConn. That's a nice win. They lost at Alabama, which isn't great, and then they lost at home against Baylor, which isn't great either, or isn't great this year. Oregon's been underwhelming. They're 9-4. They lost at MSG against Iowa. They beat Syracuse at MSG. They lost the bye game to Texas Southern. They lost at Houston, which isn't bad right now. And they lost at Baylor. Washington's 9-4. They finished their non-con play with the win over Cal State Fullerton. Their losses came against then number 11 Auburn. They lost to Minnesota and Vancouver. They beat Texas A&M, but A&M's not good this year. They lost to Gonzaga on a game-winning shot by Rui Hakamura, so can't fault them for that. They lost to Virginia Tech on a neutral. Not that bad of a loss either. So that's a team that's in play for the tournament. Oregon State's 8-4. Their notable results: they have a loss against Missouri. They beat Old Dominion. That's a decent win. They beat Penn. That's a decent win too. They lost at St. Louis. And their other wins on their schedule are not great. Stanford's 7-5. They play UCLA tonight on ESPN. Their losses are against North Carolina. They had a game that was canceled against Wofford because of the wildfires. They won 1 game in Battle for Atlantis, which was the last place game against Stanford, in which they avoided last place in that. They lost to Kansas in overtime, but you got to give them credit for giving Kansas a game. They lost to San Francisco, and San Francisco is one of the better teams in the West Coast Conference this year. UCLA is an underwhelming 7-6. Their best win was at home against Notre Dame. Other than that, they did not do well in the non-con. USC is an underwhelming 7-6. I'm interested to see how they come out in conference play, which begins tonight for them. They lost to Vanderbilt, but that was when Vanderbilt had their point guard healthy. They lost to Texas Tech. I think they did lose a bye game somewhere. They lost to Nevada. That's not a bad loss. They lost badly at the Staples Center to TCU. They lost at Santa Clara in double overtime. They lost to Oklahoma. Washington State's 7-6. I'm sure they have a couple bye losses. They usually lose bye games. They lost at Seattle. They lost at New Mexico State. Lost a bye game to Montana State. They lost in Vegas to New Mexico State and San Diego. And they really don't have any good wins. And they lost a bye game to Santa Clara. And they begin conference play Saturday night at Washington. Utah's 6-6. And Utah just lost to Nevada. They lost to Minnesota. They won 1 game in the Wood in Legacy, which was against Grand Canyon. They have losses to Hawaii, Northwestern, and Woodin. They knocked off Tulsa, which looks like a decent win. They lost to BYU. They lost at Rupp Arena, the then number 19 Kentucky. That's no shame. In California is an underwhelming 5-7. They had a game canceled against Detroit Mercy due to the wildfires. They lost to Yale in their first game. They lost to St. John's and Temple at the Barclays Center. They lost to St. Mary's in a year St. Mary's is down. Lost at home to San Francisco. They knocked off San Diego State, which looks like their best win at the moment. They have a loss at Fresno State. And they lost a bye game to Seattle. Next conference we're going to do is the SEC. We're going to try to get this done quick. Mississippi State's number 17 right now. They're 12-1. They don't get conference play on their way until next week. And some of them, these teams start on Saturday, I believe. But I have to give Mississippi State credit. They have one loss, which came in Vegas against Arizona State, and Arizona State's decent. Good wins for Mississippi State. They have a couple of them. St. Mary's would have been a good win a few years ago. At Dayton is a true road win, so you got to give him credit for at least getting a true road win in non-con play. Because sometimes it's ballsy to schedule non-con road games, and sometimes they lose them. Because I remember Indiana went to Fort Wayne, or whatever. Yeah, it was Fort Wayne, and they lost. Mississippi State hosted Clemson and got a win there. In that spot, they have a win over Cincinnati. They have a win over BYU. They have a win over Wofford. Tennessee's an amazing 11-1. Their lone loss came against Kansas in overtime at the Barclays Center. Good wins for them include against Louisville, against Georgia Tech, which isn't really that good of a win, but it's a notable win. Their best win came on a neutral against Gonzaga. They won at Memphis in a true road game. They knocked off Wake Forest. And they begin conference play Saturday at home against Georgia. Number 12 Auburn has 2 losses on the year. One of them came recently at NC State. And among the rest of their resume, they have a win over Dayton. They have a win over then number 25 Washington. They have a win over Xavier and Maui. And their other loss came against Duke and Maui. Not going to fault them for that. They have a win over Arizona and Maui. Kentucky's 10-2. They have turned it around after what was a slow start for them. Their 2 losses came against Duke on the neutral on opening night and then against Seton Hall at Madison Square Garden. They begin conference play Saturday at Alabama. That game's going to be on ESPN. Among their good wins, they have against North Carolina on a neutral. That's their best win right now. And then they won at Louisville, which is a good road win. And they won at home against Utah as well. Ole Miss is a surprising 10-2. Their 2 losses came against Butler, at Butler, and then the Emerald Coast Classic against Cincinnati. Good wins for them include on neutral against Baylor, home San Diego. They won on a true road court at Illinois State. They beat Chattanooga. They won at Middle Tennessee. Just got to give that team some credit. LSU's 10-3. They're a preseason ranked team. They begin conference play at home against Alabama Tuesday night. They have a win at home against Memphis. They have a win over Louisiana Tech. That looks pretty good right now. They have a win over Charleston. They lost to Florida State and Oklahoma State in the Advocare Invitational. Their other loss came at then number 24 Houston. They knocked off St. Mary's in a year St. Mary's isn't that great. They handed then number 24 Furman their first loss. Alabama's 9-3. They begin conference play Saturday. I'm interested to see how they perform. They lost on a neutral to Northeastern. They have a good win on a neutral against Wichita State, or I should say a notable win. They lost at UCF. They beat Murray State, who's the OVC favorite right now. They have a win over Arizona, which is decent. They have a win over Penn State, which may not be that decent. They have a true road win at Stephen F. Austin. Arkansas is 9-3. They have the good win against Indiana. They lost to Texas in the Armed Forces Classic on the first week of the season. They lost at home to Western Kentucky. They lost at home to Georgia Tech. They won at Colorado State. Missouri's 9-3 without Jonte Porter. Interested to see how this team performs in conference play. They lost to Iowa State. They have a neutral win over Oregon State. They have a neutral loss against number 12 Kansas State. They lost at home to Temple. And Temple's one of the better teams in the AAC this year. They beat UCF at home in overtime. They have a win over Xavier. Neither Xavier is underwhelming. They have a win at Illinois. Neither Illinois is underwhelming. Vanderbilt's 9-3, and they're without their star point guard, as we've mentioned several times already on this podcast today. They have a win over USC. They have a win over a Liberty team that I thought overachieved a little bit in the non-con part of their schedule. They lost to NC State. That's not terrible. They have the home win over Arizona State, which will look good. They lost to Kansas State. Florida's 8-4. They've been a little worse than I expected. They have that bad loss on opening night to then number 17 Florida State. They lost to Oklahoma in Battle for Atlantis. They knocked off Stanford in Battle for Atlantis, but Stanford's not good. They lost to Butler in Battle for Atlantis, but they avenged that loss with a big win over Butler at home a few days ago. They won at MSG over West Virginia. They lost at home against then number 10 Michigan State. Georgia's 8-4 under Tom Crean, as that's not that terrible. They lost at Temple. That's not bad. They have a win over Illinois State. They lost to Clemson. They lost to Arizona State. That's okay. No shame in that. They have a win at Georgia Tech. That might be their best win right now. Texas A&M is an underwhelming 6-5. They lost to Gonzaga. They lost to Washington. They lost to Texas A&M. I'm sorry, Minnesota. They had a game against Boston College that got canceled. They have a win over Marshall, but Marshall's not as good as I thought. They have a bye loss against Texas Southern. And last but not least, South Carolina's 5-7, which is probably the worst team in the SEC right now. They had a bye loss to Stony Brook, and Stony Brook isn't bad. Providence, they lost to on a neutral. They have a win over an underwhelming George Washington team. They lost badly at home to Wofford. They lost to Michigan. They lost at home to Virginia. They lost at home to Clemson. They lost at Wyoming. So yeah, very underwhelming for South Carolina. And quickly, I want to go over the West Coast Conference real quick. Go over Gonzaga's resume along with a couple other decent teams from that conference. Obviously, Gonzaga has the losses at North Carolina and on the neutral at Tennessee. Good wins including at Creighton, home against Washington. Obviously, their signature win on the neutral against then number 1 Duke, and they're number 1 right now. And they beat Arizona. They have a win over A&M, and A&M, we talked about them. They're underwhelming. They have a win over Texas Southern, and Texas Southern's knocked off a couple teams this year. Loyola Marymount is 12-2. Their 2 losses came in December. One at UCLA. They got their butts kicked, and they lost to UC Riverside. They have a good win at home against Boise State. They have a win at UNLV. They have a win against Georgetown, which actually is a decent win right now. You have San Francisco, who's 12-2. And they did a good job in the non-con. That canceled game due to the wildfires against Arizona State's going to hurt them. They beat Harvard. That's a good win. Stephen F. Austin could win the Southland. I talked about them a little bit. One of their losses came against Buffalo, which isn't a bad loss because Buffalo's ranked. They knocked off Stanford. They lost to Santa Barbara, and Santa Barbara is actually 11-3, I think. So that's not a bad loss. San Diego is 11-4. They play tonight against Santa Clara. I think Santa Clara can win that game. San Diego has a loss at Washington. They have 4 losses on there. That's one of them. They have a win over Colorado. That looks like a good win. They lost at Ole Miss. That actually isn't that bad of a loss. Ole Miss has been a surprise. They won at San Diego State, which is impressive. They lost at Oregon. They won against Washington State on a neutral. They lost to Drake on a neutral. And they knocked off Grand Canyon most recently. And last but not least, Pacific, they're 10-5. In conference play, they play BYU today. BYU's 8-7 on the year, but they're actually a 4-point favorite in that game. That's weird to me. One of their losses were at Nevada, who was number 7 at the time. No shame in that. They lost to UNLV, who's been underwhelming. They have a loss against Abilene Christian, who's been an overachiever in the SWAC this year. They lost against Fresno State, which isn't the worst thing in the world. And they lost at Boise State, and then the rest of their schedule, they took care of business, so give credit to Pacific. And that's it for today before I give out my best bet, which is a 12-team moneyline parlay in college basketball. Plus 440 to win $6.21. Wofford, Indiana, Furman, St. Francis of Pennsylvania, Michigan, East Tennessee State, Louisiana, Murray State, Arizona State, Green Bay, Belmont, and Weber State. Plus 440 to win $6.21. That's it for today. Pretty long podcast today. About an hour and 40 minutes long. I'll be back tomorrow recapping everything from college hoops to NBA to NHL. Do NHL power rankings tomorrow. Give out my picks for Wild Card Weekend and a lot more. Hope you guys have a great day, everybody.